Yeah, I did. And let me explain to you why I did. When this whole situation got mired in legality and really complex, legal wranglings.
They were the kings of blue-eyed soul, pop titans with unstoppable hooks and harmonies so tight they masked every crack underneath. But behind the music videos, magazine spreads, and billboard-topping singles was a quiet war. Daryl Hall and John Oates weren't just bandmates. They were bound by a decades-long contract of success, resentment, and silence. They made history together, but at what cost? Why did one of music's most iconic duos end in betrayal, legal warfare, and a bitter public unraveling? Long before the neon signs and platinum plaques, Daryl Hall and John Oates were just two kids surviving the chaotic soundtrack of 1960s Philadelphia. This wasn't the polished soul of Motown or the glitzy rock of the Sunset Strip. It was raw, unfiltered, violent. A place where music and menace coexisted on the same street corner. They didn't meet at a record label party. They weren't introduced by some influential producer. Their origin story began in blood and panic. It was 1967 at the Adelphi Ballroom, a venue where teenage dreams were sold for $2 a ticket, and gang allegiances bled into every corner. Both were scheduled to perform that night when gunshots shattered the rhythm. A fight between rival crews erupted into chaos. People screamed, bodies ducked, and Hall and Oates fled together into a freight elevator. That moment, sheltering in metal and fear, was the start of something strange and magnetic. They bonded over a shared love for soul music, doo-wop harmonies, and the black radio stations that shaped their childhoods. Hall, with his church-trained tenor, was pure electricity. Oates, quieter but razor-sharp, brought the structure and streetwise instincts. Together, they built a new kind of sound. Not fully black, not fully white, not quite pop or rock, but something uncategorizable. Something dangerous. They played colleges. They cut demos. They were often too strange for labels to understand. But eventually, someone did, and the contracts followed. But even in those earliest years, the spell of Philadelphia came with a cost. Hall had the spotlight, the face, the voice, the image. Oates was already being relegated to the margins. The partner, the rhythm guitarist, the glue. No one noticed, not yet. Because when a spell is first cast, it feels like magic. But magic always hides a price. By 1975, the myth of Hall and Oates had started to harden. They were no longer just two kids from Philly. They were artists now, building tracks inside Electric Lady Studios, the sonic temple that Jimi Hendrix once built with his own hands. That sacred place had witnessed the unraveling of geniuses. Now it would bear witness to something quieter, a slow divide hidden behind harmony. It was here they recorded Sarah's Smile, a love letter, a confession, a hit. The song cracked the Billboard Top 10 and marked their true arrival. But behind the boards, something was shifting. Hall began using the studio as his altar. He labored over takes, rewrote lyrics on the spot, and guided the entire mix with obsessive precision. He was chasing something, perfection, maybe, or control. Oates still played, still harmonized, but his presence had begun to blur. He was no longer part of the conversation, just the execution. Still essential, but slowly becoming invisible. Their manager, Tommy Mottola, saw it immediately. He had a gift for branding, and Daryl Hall was a dream. Tall, blonde, magnetic. The kind of man MTV would someday consume like candy. Oates didn't fit the image. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't headline material, but he was loyal, quiet, unthreatening. So the deal was made, unspoken but absolute. Hall would lead, Oates would follow. No solo records, no side projects. They would remain unified, publicly, professionally, aesthetically. They called it strategy, but in truth, it was a blood oath, one that would define the next decade, one that would not survive the one after. The year was 1981. Private Eyes hit #1, and Hall and Oates were crowned the most successful duo in music history. They had surpassed Simon and Garfunkel. They were icons. Their faces adorned magazine covers. Their videos ran on loop on MTV. But inside their glittering success, something dark had taken root. They weren't fighting, not publicly, not yet. But the silence was starting to curdle. Daryl Hall had grown hungry for freedom, for credit, for solo acclaim. He wanted to stretch beyond the formula, experiment. control the narrative. Meanwhile, Oates was being erased in real time. Interviewers addressed questions only to Hall. Fans confused his name, and press photographers often cropped him out of frame. He wasn't just being sidelined, he was being rewritten. Their friendship became transactional. They traveled separately, stayed in separate rooms, built separate lives on parallel tracks, and still, the hits kept coming. But the music had changed too. What was once a collaborative process had calcified into assembly lines. Hall would bring in near-finished demos. Oates would nod, contribute harmonies, tweak a few measures. Sometimes, not even that. There were whispers of solo records being quietly pursued, of meetings with A&R reps that didn't include both of them. They were building an empire, but brick by brick, it was splitting down the middle. Still, neither was ready to walk away, because walking away would mean admitting it was already over. When MTV launched in 1981, Hall and Oates were poised to dominate. Their music was already tailor-made for the new format, catchy, sleek, and drenched in radio polish. Man-Eater, I Can't Go For That, and Out of Touch weren't just hits. They became visual events, cultural signatures of a generation raised on music videos, but the very medium that immortalized their success also began to fracture their partnership in plain sight. MTV didn't broadcast sound, it broadcast image. And the image was clear. Daryl Hall was the star. His golden hair caught the light just right. He was always in center frame, always front and forward. Oates, if shown at all, was a blur in the corner, silhouetted, half-lit, strategically minimized. Their once fluid chemistry became a script, movements rehearsed, expressions staged. Even their harmonies began to sound engineered. The intimacy that once defined them was now replaced by visual distance. Fans noticed, critics whispered, and behind the scenes, Oates felt it deeply. He spoke up, asked for balance, fought for creative input, but the machine had made its choice. MTV didn't want two faces, they wanted one. And Daryl Hall was it. Label executives leaned into the illusion. Publicists molded the narrative. The duo became a brand. One face, one voice, one marketable figure. Oates began to fade, not from lack of talent, but from institutional erasure. He was still there, still writing, playing, touring, but his presence was no longer visible. He became the phantom of his own success. And yet, the machine kept moving. They accepted Grammys, played sold-out arenas, smiled for press junkets. But off-camera, the silence between them had grown heavy and permanent. By the late 1980s, the world had moved on from Hall and Oates mania. The charts were changing. Pop music was splintering. But their brand, nostalgic, lucrative, and built on years of shared history, still held immense value. And that's when the music began to take a backseat to something else: ownership. Oates, long portrayed as the quiet partner, began focusing on the business, publishing rights, trademarks, royalties. He saw the writing on the wall. If he didn't protect his share now, it could vanish in the shadow of Hall's growing solo ambitions. Hall, meanwhile, dove deeper into side projects. He collaborated with icons, explored new genres, and flirted with a solo identity that was no longer tethered to the duo. But his need for control didn't fade. If anything, it sharpened. He wasn't just the voice anymore. He wanted to be the architect. Inevitably, tension turned to conflict. There were disagreements about licensing, about control over touring revenue, about long-term rights to the catalog they'd built together. Hall's perfectionism collided with Oates's pragmatism. The friction wasn't personal until it was. Then came the rumors that Oates had considered selling his half of their joint venture without informing Hall. That deals were being explored behind closed doors. Daryl called it betrayal. Oates called it self-preservation. Whatever the truth, the dynamic shifted permanently. They were no longer co-creators. They were rivals, guarding legacies, protecting assets, and preparing for separation. And somewhere along the way, the music had stopped altogether. In the 2000s, Daryl Hall re-emerged, this time not through a chart-topping hit, but through a living room. Live from Daryl's House premiered quietly, a laid-back performance series that invited musicians into Hall's private space. It was raw, personal, and controlled entirely by him. And it worked. The series earned acclaim, awards, and a new generation of fans. Oates was not a fixture on the show. Occasionally, he'd appear as a guest, cordial, careful, out of place. But the subtext was loud. This wasn't Hall and Oates. This was Hall alone, finally unbound. Meanwhile, Oates carved out a quiet path. He released introspective solo albums, dabbled in Americana, and penned a memoir that leaned more toward reflection than revelation. His voice never cracked headlines. His face didn't return to TV screens, but he remained loyal to the duo's legacy, publicly at least. For years, they maintained a truce, professional, polished, civil, until 2023. That year, Oates allegedly tried to sell his share of their business partnership to a private third party. Hall responded with a lawsuit. He didn't just claim business interference, he called it betrayal, a breach of trust, a breaking of something sacred. Suddenly, the curtain was yanked back. The truth wasn't just tension or rivalry, it was war, legal filings, public statements, years of resentment unspooling in real time. What had begun in a freight elevator in Philadelphia now ended in court documents and cease and desist orders. The empire had fallen, and neither wanted to be blamed for the wreckage. November 2023, a story leaked that no one saw coming. Daryl Hall had filed a lawsuit against John Oates, but this wasn't a contract dispute or a passive royalty disagreement. It was a restraining order. According to court documents, Hall accused Oates of attempting to secretly sell his share of Whole Oates Enterprises, LLP, the company that controlled their shared catalog, touring rights, and decades of intellectual property. The alleged sale, Hall claimed, would inflict irreparable harm and violate the core of their long-standing business agreement. It wasn't just a financial maneuver, it was framed as a betrayal. Fans were blindsided. The press swarmed. For years, Hall and Oates had appeared untouchable, separate but civil. The lawsuit shattered that illusion, and for the first time, the cracks were undeniable. In his filing, Hall used words that burned: the ultimate partnership betrayal. He portrayed Oates as calculating, accused him of waiting for the perfect moment when Hall was distracted by other projects to push the sale through without warning. Oates remained quiet. Publicly, he said nothing, but his legal team issued carefully worded responses, ones that hinted at long-term inequality, creative marginalization, and a man finally seeking agency after decades in the background. For years, they had both chosen silence. Now, silence was no longer an option. Their truths, long buried, would have to be spoken under oath. As the court battle unfolded, new filings emerged. Many were heavily redacted, entire pages of black bars hiding the details of private communications, contract terms, and years of unresolved disputes. Still, even through the redactions, one thing became clear. This wasn't a sudden rupture. It had been quietly unraveling for years. Insiders spoke of Oates's growing frustration, of being locked into a partnership where decisions weren't equal, where his voice didn't carry the same weight. Others claimed Hall had long seen himself as a solo artist forced into compromise. The redacted sections told a darker story of failed negotiations, licensing disputes, and buried attempts to dissolve the entity, of music that had been recorded but never released, of personal wounds that never healed. There were emails, blacked out but damning, references to ignored pleas, stalled projects, legal strategies, bits and fragments that painted a picture of rot beneath the surface. Whatever was behind those black lines was too volatile to print, and maybe that's why it had stayed buried for so long. Not just to protect reputations, but to protect what was left of a legacy already collapsing under its own weight. When the cameras finally caught up to them, it wasn't fireworks, it was fatigue. Daryl Hall, in a clipped interview, delivered his verdict. "John and I are business partners. We are not creative partners." It wasn't a dig, it was a disassociation, one that rewrote decades of shared history in a single sentence. Oates responded days later. Calm, deliberate, and almost mournful, he described the lawsuit as painful, but necessary. He still believed in their body of work, still honored the music, But the partnership? That was something else entirely. Neither offered apologies, neither claimed fault, and neither spoke with the intimacy of former collaborators. The myth had finally dissolved. For years, the world had believed in the image. Two equal minds, one iconic sound. But what remained now was division. A creative imbalance no longer disguised, a business partnership strained past the breaking point. Music historians began to rewrite the narrative, re-examining who led, who followed, who faded, and who had been fading all along. Their story was no longer about harmony. It was about what had gone unsaid. Today, Hall and Oates are frozen in legal standoff. The lawsuit remains unresolved. Hall Oates Enterprises, the business they built together, lingers in a kind of purgatory. Its assets trapped in litigation, its future unclear. There is no final tour, no public goodbye, no shared statement, only silence. Hall continues to tour solo, performing the songs that once belonged to both of them. His stage is his own now, his spotlight undivided. Oates releases new music under his own name, subtle, reflective, and far from the commercial spotlight they once shared. He speaks of peace, but avoids speaking of Hall. What was once the most successful duo in music history now moves forward as strangers. There is no single moment that ended it, just decades of drift, of unspoken resentment, of one man's rise and another's slow erasure. And finally, a lawsuit that made the fracture impossible to ignore. They were never supposed to end this way. But maybe, in the quiet spaces between them, the ending had already begun long ago. Two voices, once inseparable, now locked in a silence louder than any song. They gave us hits that defined decades, but behind the harmony was a partnership unraveling in silence. Daryl Hall and John Oates didn't just break up, they broke down. And now, the truth is out. Subscribe for more buried stories like this. And tell us, was it betrayal or inevitability?